And I was buried beneath my shame. Who could carry that kind of weight? It was my tomb till I met you. And I was breathing but not alive. All my failures I tried to hide. It was my tomb till I met you. You called my name and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. You called my name and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. Now your mercy has saved my soul. Now your freedom is all that I know. The old made new, Jesus, when I met you. You called my name and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. You called my name and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. I needed rescue, my sin was heavy, but chains break at the weight of your glory. I needed shelter, I was an orphan, now you call me a citizen of heaven. When I was broken, you were my healing, now your love is the air that I'm breathing. I have a future, my eyes are open, 'cause when you called my name, I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. You called my name and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day.
He has risen indeed. Good morning, Chartwell, and happy Easter. I am Linda Joy and I'm on staff here at the church. Welcome to our Easter service. This is definitely a way different service to what we are used to having on an Easter morning. We are used to gathering and being with family and friends. But as I walked through the building this week, I realized that it was empty and cold. And it's the people that make our church what it is. It has been lovely to be able to connect with different people in our congregation and just to see how people have reached out and supported each other. If for some or unknown reason you have not been part of any of those connections, please feel free to contact our office at 905-844-2801 or email office@chartwellchurch.com. Kevin, Dan, the elders, or myself are also willing to connect you up with different programs or find the link that would be best suited for you. Let us pray together. Because you live, I can face tomorrow. Because you live, all fear is gone. Because I know you hold the future, life is worth living because you live. As we face so many unknowns at the moment and live day by day, this Easter Sunday gives us hope. Easter Sunday reminds us that what you did for us so many years ago on the cross. God, it is because of your love for me, for each one of us, that you sent your Son Jesus to die. But most importantly, he did not stay in that grave. He conquered death and he rose again. Thank you for this hope that you give us on this morning, April the 12th, 2020. Hope that you know our future and what it looks like. We pray this in your name. Amen.
In Christ alone, my hope is found. He is my light, my strength, my song. This cornerstone, this solid ground, firm through the fiercest drought and storm. What heights of love, what depths of peace, when fears are stilled, when striving cease. My comforter, my all in all, here in the love of Christ I stand. In Christ alone, who took on flesh, fullness of God in helpless babe, this gift of love and righteousness, scorned by the ones he came to save, till on that cross, as Jesus died, the wrath of God was satisfied. For every sin on him was laid. Here in the death of Christ I live. There in the ground his body lay, light of the world in darkness slain, then bursting forth in glorious day, up from the grave he rose again. And as he stands in victory, sin's curse has lost its grip on me. For I am his and he is mine, bought with the precious love of Christ. No guilt in life, no fear in death. This is the power of Christ in me. From life's first cry to final breath, Jesus commands my destiny. No power of hell, no scheme of man can ever pluck me from his hand, till he returns or calls me home. Here in the power of Christ I'll stand. No power of hell, no scheme of man can ever pluck me from his hand, till he returns or calls me home. Here in the power of Christ I'll stand.
Well, good morning, everybody. Happy Easter Sunday. He is risen. He's risen indeed. So glad that you're choosing to join us this morning and spend some time with us on this Easter Sunday, Resurrection Sunday. So glad that you're choosing to be here. If you're part of the regular Chartwell family, I miss seeing your faces, but I'm glad that we can at least spend a bit of time in this format this morning. For those of you, maybe you're not even familiar with Chartwell, or maybe someone else has invited you to come along and watch. Just really glad you're here. Give you a special welcome, and thanks for tuning in, and hope you'll stick around for the next few moments as we talk a bit about the importance and the meaning of Easter, of Resurrection Sunday in our tradition. This morning we gather online to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. And for those of you who've been around Chartwell for the next few years, we will also be celebrating the conclusion of our study of Mark. This is actually week 45 and the last week of our series of studying Mark's Gospel. And so it's a timely ending that we come to chapter 16, the story of the resurrection, actually on Easter Sunday this morning. And so that's what we get to do, is focus on Easter Sunday today as we gather together. And it's Easter Sunday. It is Resurrection Sunday that gives any meaning to Good Friday whatsoever. If Jesus had not been raised from the dead, his death would have been but one of many people who had died for some cause or another at the hands of a powerful empire like the Roman Empire, or even at the hands of petty, small-minded jealousy like the religious leaders in first century Jerusalem. If Jesus had simply died, his would have been a death remembered by virtually no one. But because of Sunday, his death on Friday takes on tremendous significance and tremendous meaning for all of us. And today, the cross, which we talked a little bit about on Friday, the cross of Jesus persists as a symbol of our faith, of Christian faith and history, and of Jesus himself, for exactly the one reason that we gather today, and that is that Jesus rose from the dead. He rose on the third day, just as he said he would, and this has been the story of our faith for 2,000 years, and it has never changed. It has been the galvanizing truth of what we believe, that Jesus, though died on Friday, was alive on Sunday, just as he said that he would be. Before we dive into the text this morning, I want to ask you to just reflect for a moment on a word. And the word I'd like you to think about is the word irreversible. I want you just to think about what comes to mind with the word or the concept irreversible. And I know we could technically define it and what part of speech it makes up, but more to the point, how has the word irreversible taken up personal, important meaning in your life? Can you think of an event or a time where the cold, hard brutality of an irreversible circumstance struck you full in the face, right in the deepest part of who you are? I think as we go through our lives, we progressively learn through the difficult blows that life often sends us, that we often and frequently enter into circumstances and situations where we're confronted with the inevitability of those things that are irreversible. Things we desperately wish we could hunt around and find the rewind button, that we could do differently or experience differently or keep from happening. And I think we learn our lessons in life about irreversibility slowly and progressively. I reflect on my own life. I think my first experience of the horrible truth of something that is unchangeable and irreversible, in some ways it starts off kind of innocently when I think I was 9, when my dog did not come home from the vet with my dad and had been put to sleep, and I was struck with this cruel truth that my dog was gone and there was nothing I could do about it. And then as I grew up in my life, the depth of the meaning of irreversible continued to grow when I was 16 and I lost a friend in a car accident. And that sense of the irreversible becomes heavier. I experienced it obviously when my mom died a few years ago. And 2 years ago to this day, as a matter of fact, I experienced it when I discovered the body of a close friend who had taken his own life. And the gravity of circumstances that we just can't change, that we can't go back and do over, take up residence in our life, and they are hard things to go through. Irreversible. And I know that each of us, has lived through those seasons and those places and those times where we just wish we could go back. We just wish we could see something play out differently. Those feelings, that longing, that desire to just see a different outcome, it's a very human experience, and I'm really convinced that the disciples were feeling those things just the same way we feel them, you and I feel them. That if we were to go back into the first century on that Holy Saturday and that Easter Sunday of that first Easter weekend, we would have seen the disciples of Jesus experiencing the same depth of emotions that you and I feel. The day after Jesus died, they would have been caught up in those places, those cycles of thinking. We don't get a lot of detail from the scriptures about those days. The Gospels don't tell us a ton. Luke and John, their Gospels both tell us that they observed the Sabbath, and they observed the quiet, the rest that occurs on that day. But more than that, we get a glimpse, we get a snapshot of them huddled together in these rooms, overwhelmed with grief, fearing for their lives, fear from the authorities, fear from the Roman authorities. You know, if they had killed Jesus, there's no reason to believe that as his followers that they were necessarily safe and off the hook. But beyond the fear, we know that there was tremendous grief. The one that they loved more than anyone was dead. The one they had pledged their lives to was gone. And the pain that they experienced was no different than the pain you and I experience when we lose someone close to us. You don't stare into that reality. You don't stare into that abyss of death and feel nothing. You know, what they experienced would be just like what we experience. There would have been no realistic hope that we would see our loved one walk back through the door again. And the disciples didn't have any realistic hope that they would see Jesus again. We know at this point in the story, they had not remembered, they had not grasped the significance of what Jesus had said to them over the course of his life, specifically about how he would be handed over, suffer, be crucified, and rise again. For whatever reason, the true depth of this was either missed by them or it was hidden from them. But what we find on that Saturday and Sunday morning is the disciples grieving and fearing and lost and in despair. And they knew just as well as you and I do the meaning of the word irreversible. And I imagine there must have been a lot of if-only thoughts flying through their heads that day. That game that we play when something goes wrong. If only, if only, if only. I'm sure the disciples were doing the same thing you and I do. If only we'd stayed away from Jerusalem. If only we hadn't gone walking in the Garden of Gethsemane on Thursday night. If only someone had testified at the trial in his favor. If only I hadn't deserted him. And in fact, of all the disciples that were in that room on Saturday and Sunday, I'm pretty certain it was Peter who suffered these thoughts most deeply and most profoundly as he came face to face with the death of Jesus. And these are thoughts not unlike our own when we look back with regret or sadness on things that have not gone the way we'd hoped. We can ask, you know, those if only questions. If only I'd turned left instead of right. If only I'd remembered to turn off the stove. If only I had taken better care of my health. If only, if only, if only. And these words of regret in the face of irreversible play themselves over and over in our minds and in our lives, because to a certain extent we all live with regrets. We all live with the what could have beens or what we wish had been different. We regret the choices we make. We regret the actions that we make. We regret the words we've spoken. We regret the words we haven't spoken. Irreversible can become another word for despair. Those things that we can't change, those things that are just beyond our ability to do over, can leave us despairing. And I'm convinced that the disciples of Jesus had it in full measure that first Easter morning. We're going to come to our text this morning, Mark chapter 16. We're going to look at verses 1 to 8. I want to encourage you to listen as I read Mark's account of that first Easter Sunday. Mark chapter 16, and read verses 1 to 8. And this is how the story goes. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You're looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he's going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were so afraid. Some interesting stuff gets revealed in this story. First of all, we see the women going early that Sunday morning with spices, it says, to anoint Jesus' body. Here's what's really key. We've got to remember, those women, even when we saw their great faithfulness in staying with Jesus on the Friday, staying with him at the cross, not leaving like the other disciples did, and faithfully showing up on Sunday morning, they did not expect to find Jesus alive. There's nothing to this point in their lives which has led them to believe they will find anything except Jesus' dead body, which they themselves had been present with on Friday when he was buried in the tomb with Joseph of Arimathea. They brought spices, not because they expected him to be alive. They brought spices because they were expecting to embalm him. They were expecting Jesus to be in the tomb just where they left him. But obviously they get there and they find the tomb stone rolled away and the tomb itself empty. And a young man, it says, dressed in white, standing to one side, who presumably is an angel, says to them that Jesus of Nazareth has risen. The Nazarene is alive, the one who was crucified. And the angel says, go, tell the disciples and Peter. Tell them to go to Galilee, back where it all began, and Jesus will meet them there. And Mark says the women flee. They're terrified, they're confused, and initially they don't speak to anyone. We know that eventually, and we know from the other Gospels, that they do in fact overcome their fear, their terror, and alarm at the missing body and the presence of this man in white. They overcome that fear, and they do obviously tell the disciples, and they do tell Peter and John who go to the tomb. But at this point, they are initially alarmed and confused and afraid. And that's the picture that Mark leaves us with. We got to grasp sort of the shock of those words. He is not here, he is risen. Because the empty tomb proves the first part of that statement, he is not here. But it doesn't necessarily prove the second part of that statement. It doesn't prove that he is risen. And what's going through the minds of the women at this point? Have they even begun to consider that Jesus has reversed the irreversible? Have they even begun to grasp that what they thought was over and done is in fact just beginning? We can jump ahead and borrow from John's Gospel, and we can go to the Gospel of John chapter 20. And John gives us a bit more detail around what happens following the empty tomb. We read in John chapter 20, verses 19 and 20, it says, on the evening of that first day of the week when the disciples were together, so this would be Sunday night, with the doors locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. They were overjoyed. The one who was dead was alive. And John tells us when they saw him, when they saw his hands, when they saw his side, they were overjoyed. It's a funny word, overjoyed. Have you ever thought about that word? Overjoyed. It's like overfed or overstimulated. You know, these guys were overjoyed. What does that look like? What does it mean to be overjoyed? I think it probably looks like laughing and crying and backslapping and hugging and talking excitedly over one another, and the words come faster than their ability to articulate them. Their response is visceral, physical, mental, emotional, verbal, every part of them, full and overflowing with joy, because Jesus is not dead. Jesus, 3 days after he was killed, was alive again. And he's not just a ghost. He's not some disembodied spirit, as some people try to say that Jesus' resurrection was just a spiritual one. It was a physical one. Matthew 28 says the disciples touched him. John 20, Jesus invites Thomas to touch his wounds. We read in Luke that Jesus ate with them. He asked for a fish and he ate. And in 1 Corinthians 15, the Apostle Paul tells us that Jesus appeared physically to over 500 witnesses in a period of about 6 weeks after his resurrection. This was not just a spiritual thing. This was a physical and tangible reality. Jesus was alive, he had defeated death, and he had reversed what was believed to be irreversible. Romans 6 verse 9 says this, it says, Christ having been raised from the dead is never to die again. Death is no longer master over him. And in Revelation chapter 1 verse 18, Jesus himself said, I am the living one. Behold, I am dead, but I am now alive forevermore. Easter morning, it marks the end of what was once irreversible, and it marks the beginning of God's new creation. And here's where I would really like us to focus now this morning for just a few moments. In Mark chapter 16, with the angel in the tomb and the women who arrived that morning, in verse 7, he says this to them. He says, the place where they laid him, see here, it is empty. But go, tell his disciples and Peter. Go tell the disciples and Peter. Peter is already seeing himself as outside of the circle. He's already viewing himself as cut off. And we spoke a couple weeks ago about Peter's denial of Jesus and how he wept bitterly. And how in Mark's gospel, we don't see Peter appear again. This isn't the only other mention we get is when the angel says to the women, go tell Peter. Peter must already be seeing himself no longer as one of the disciples, no longer as part of that group. And Peter is feeling adrift and he's despairing as though his entire life is adrift. In fact, the one thing that he had staked his entire life on, his identity and purpose and everything that he thought his life was going to be about, his very purpose for living was gone. And in a very tragic sense, he gave it away. He relinquished it. When he denied Jesus, he turned his back and he thought first of himself. And so the despair and remorse that Peter is feeling must be terrible. And you know, friends, I think it's something that you and I probably can relate to. You don't need me to tell you, in fact, you probably don't need anyone to tell you that life can be brutal. And sometimes life just knocks the breath out of us. And just like Peter, we can feel adrift, we can feel lost, we can feel unanchored and disoriented and confused. But the resurrection of Jesus, it changes that. It changes that for everyone. And I want to say something this morning, and I ask you, listen to me carefully, because this is so important. It's important for all of us, and it's really important to me, because I really want you, whoever you are watching right now, I really want you to hear this and understand the significance of what Easter Sunday, Resurrection Sunday, is about. Somehow we have reduced the idea of sin down to something as simple as moral choices. That sin is simply just about choosing moral things over immoral things. And don't get me wrong, I absolutely believe there is a God-shaped morality, that there is a Jesus-shaped morality. But if we reduce the purpose of the cross of Jesus and the resurrection down to nothing more than Jesus dealing with our bad and moral choices, then we're going to fall far short of understanding the significance of Easter, of the cross, and of the resurrection. Does the cross deal with our bad moral choices? Yes, absolutely. Does the resurrection deal with Jesus' authority to deal with our bad moral choices? Yes, absolutely it does. But the death and resurrection of Jesus are they're not just about what we are rescued from. They are also about, and equally, maybe even more so, about what we are rescued for. Yes, we are rescued from things like bad choices, like falling short, those kind of things that we so frequently connect to this idea of sin. We're definitely rescued from those things and from the consequences of those things, but we are equally rescued for something. We are rescued for more than we have experienced before, and this is really what I want to stress for you. If you go all the way back to the beginning of this story, in Genesis chapter 1 to 3, we get the story of Adam and Eve. And now, we could have a long conversation about whether we believe Adam and Eve are literal historical figures, and was the Garden of Eden a real, literal geographic place, or are these metaphors or images that the writer of Genesis is trying to communicate? And I think it's important to have that conversation, not the least of which being that those questions about were Adam and Eve literal people, were they real, was it a real place, those are actually pretty uniquely 21st century Western questions. Those aren't ancient Near Eastern questions. Ancient pre-Hebraic people who would have read the story of Adam and Eve were not asking the question, oh gee, I wonder if they're real people, I wonder if Eden's a real place. Those were not the questions they were primarily concerned with. They were concerned in what does the story teach us about God and teach us about ourselves. So I don't want us to get sidetracked on that, and don't let those questions cloud what I want to talk about here for a moment. Okay, even though those are good questions to have. But what we have given to us in Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3, these people named Adam and Eve, this primal pair that are intended to represent all of us. The name Adam comes from the Hebrew word Adama, which means humanity. And I don't think that's a coincidence. So we've got Adam and Eve, this primal couple here that represent all of us. And I just recently heard N.T. Wright speak about this, and he talks about Adam and Eve and how they, and therefore all of us, were created as image bearers of God. And that creation, this physical world that we inhabit, is the space that God opened up wherein and whereby he would come and dwell with us, and we would come and dwell with him. And so our purpose as image bearers, in fact, our vocation as image bearers had two primary purposes. And N.T. Wright says it's like standing in this threshold between the created world we see and God. And that our vocation, our purpose as image bearers of God has two purposes. The first purpose is that we are created to extend the love and care of God out into creation, out into the world that we inhabit. And secondly, we are intended to extend creation's act of worship back to God as those who revere him and honor him and worship him as the creator. And the story in Genesis chapter 3 is the story of how humanity chose and continues to choose to turn away from God. And the forbidden fruit on that tree is really just an idol, and really at root all sin. All sin, all choices to turn away from God is nothing more or less than idolatry. It's to put anything or anyone, including ourselves, in the place that God alone is intended to occupy. And so that forbidden fruit that is pleasing to the eye and good for gaining knowledge or good for whatever we feel it is that we want is actually the root of sin. And it is idolatry and that sin that shatters our primary identity as image bearers of God. It shatters that, it distorts that image bearing, but it also shatters our vocation. It shatters our primary vocation to extend the love of God into creation and to extend worship back to him. And thus sin becomes the links in the chains that bind us, because we're separated from our identity and we are separated from the purpose for which each and every one of us was created. And so where we once dwelled together in the garden, we then began to move apart. And we continued to move apart and would have continued to move apart in perpetuity had not God intervened and set about to do something about it. We see the beginning of that process of doing something about it through the people of Israel and through the law and their sacrificial systems and the covenants and all those things where God was trying to bring us back together, knowing full well that they could never accomplish what he fully desired. And that was to see us restored to that right relating, that right image, and that right vocation as his image bearers. And so instead, what do we see? We see Jesus comes in the flesh. We see Jesus come as the second Adam, Paul says in Romans chapter 5. And in Colossians chapter 1, Paul says that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. And so he comes, and through his death and resurrection, he demonstrates that he has the authority to restore us, to free us, to heal us, and give us new life as image bearers of God. And he also re-bestows upon us. He gives us again, he gives back to us that God-given, that Genesis-given vocation to be the ones who extend the love of God into the world and extend worship back to our Creator in heaven, back into the presence of God. And this is what Jesus' life and death do for us. This is what his death on Friday and his resurrection on Sunday accomplish. It returns us to being what being human meant to be all along. Did that come out right? Jesus' death and resurrection makes it possible for us to once again apprehend what it means to be truly human in the way God designed us to be, each and every one of us from the beginning, to be his image bearers and to take the vocation of being his representatives to the world and his worshipers back into his presence. And this is what forgiveness does. It does not hold us, the offender, hostage. It releases us to receive the life he intended for all of us. Yes, we are rescued from sin, but we are also rescued for this new covenant, new creation life. This is what the death and resurrection of Jesus do and accomplish. We were once together, then moving apart, and at Easter, the beginning of God's new creation is unleashed, and we are now slowly but surely coming back together as we share in the image-bearing vocation, purpose for which we were all created. The curse gets reversed. Instead of separation from God, we once again dwell with him and him with us. And that's why Revelation chapter 21, the end of God's first act with creation. Jesus says in Revelation 21, a day will come when the new Jerusalem, that's the city of God, will return to earth. It will come to earth, and the dwelling place of God will once again be with his people. This is just the beginning of the full implications of what it means that Jesus rose from the dead. That we are seeing the beginning of God's new creation, this slow coming back together of God and humanity, reconciled back to the very things we were created for. So that all our feelings of being adrift and lost and confused and disoriented when life batters the breath out of us, and we wonder, what is this about? We are reminded that the curse is working in reverse, that Jesus has set everything on a trajectory back towards the way it was supposed to be from the beginning, and he is going to make all things new. He is going to set everything right again. And he did this because of his resurrection, because he demonstrated that he has the authority to do that. He, as God in the flesh, has the authority to re-bestow upon us that image we're created to bear, his image, and that vocation, that purpose for which we were called to be those who share his love into creation and extend worship to our God, our Father in heaven. Theologian Yaroslav Pelikan said this. He said, if Christ is risen, nothing else matters. And if Christ is not risen, nothing else matters. Peter, who is the voice behind Mark's gospel, the one who we see at the end of John's gospel, Jesus restoring to fellowship. Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? 3 times Jesus asks him, restores him 3 times, once for each denial. Peter, that one who was on the outside, lost and adrift, brought back into the purposes for which God had created him. Peter, the voice behind Mark's gospel. In his own letter, 2 Peter, chapter 1, verse 16, Peter says this. He says, we did not follow cleverly devised tales when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses to his majesty. His majesty was revealed in his resurrection. The resurrected, glorified Jesus, his majesty on display. And Peter says, we didn't make this up. We just didn't write clever stories. In fact, the strangest thing about Christianity is that it got off the ground at all. The strangest thing about Christianity is that this group of people who claimed Jesus was the Messiah actually acknowledged fully that he died. But they didn't stop there. They said, he rose from the dead. You know, there was lots of other people within the first century who claimed to be the Jewish Messiah. And every single one of them followed the same trajectory. They said that they were the Messiah. They assembled followers. They rose up to say that, you know, this is the Messiah. He's going to deliver us. And then without fail, the Romans would kill him. You are not the Messiah. You are not the authority that's going to overthrow Rome. And they'd be killed. And when that happened, the followers of that Messiah had 2 choices. They'd either get a new leader, maybe a brother or a cousin of their first Messiah, and set him, oh, we were wrong. This is actually the Messiah. He's the one we're going to follow. And we saw that actually repeated several times in history where one Messiah would fail and a family member would rise up and take his place. And then the same thing would happen again. He would be executed by the Romans. So that was your first option. If your Messiah failed, you found the right one and you tried again, or you just packed up your tents and you went home. If your Messiah died, you clearly had backed the wrong guy. But the followers of Jesus of Nazareth didn't do either of those things. They could have grabbed James, Jesus' brother. They could have set him up, but they didn't. They could have set up one of the disciples as the Messiah, but they didn't do that either. They could have packed it up and gone home, but they didn't. In fact, they said, no. Yeah, you tried to kill the Messiah, but Jesus rose from the dead to demonstrate that he is not only the Redeemer of Israel, he is in fact the Son of God, the King of Kings, and he is establishing his kingdom. And his kingdom is not going to end because he has defeated death and it's no longer master over him. And the new creation that he inaugurates there with his death and resurrection on the cross will be consummated when he comes together with us at the end of history, when the dwelling place of God and man and women are joined together once again. What seemed impossible before Easter becomes possible because of Easter, by faith in Jesus, by faith in his resurrection. Our separation from God has been replaced with relationship. Our despair has been replaced with hope. Our insecurity has been replaced with identity as God's children. Fear has been replaced with peace, and death has been replaced with life. Jesus is alive today. He's alive in the world. He is transforming lives like Peter, lives like Simon of Cyrene, of the Roman executioner at the cross, of Joseph of Arimathea. His new life is transforming people and bringing them back into fellowship with God, re-bestowing upon us our God-given image-bearing identity and our God-given image-bearing vocation as the ones who love like Jesus into the world and worship back to Jesus because he alone is worthy of it. He's alive today. He is at work in lives like mine, lives like yours. And he doesn't do it all at once. He doesn't flick a switch and just turn us like that. But slowly and steadily and faithfully, as we trust him and follow him with our lives, we extend his love to creation. We do it with mercy and compassion and justice and, yes, obedience. And then we extend worship back to him into his presence in spirit and in truth, in service and sacrifice, because that's what it means to be children of God. And that is what we are given because of the resurrection. New birth, new life. Because Jesus did not stay dead. Jesus is alive. And he says, behold, I'm making all things new. Listen to these words again from the Apostle Peter, in the letter he writes to the church in Galatia. He says, praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, and into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade, kept in heaven for you, who through faith are shielded by God's power until the coming of the salvation that is ready to be revealed in the last time. In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These things have come so that your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may be proved genuine and may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. That's Peter's prayer for us, and that is God's heart for us, that we would know because of Jesus being alive today, we too can be alive in him. That the chains that bound us, that sin and brokenness and the distorted images that we live with, and in a lot of cases, the distorted images we ourselves perpetuate, can be reversed because Jesus reversed the curse. Jesus has broken the chains, and we are now free to be reconnected and re-identified as his children and re-released into our God-given purposes, to love him, to love creation and every person in it, and to worship him back before him because he alone is good. I'm so glad you joined us this morning. I pray that you will know the real life-changing, transformative power of the life of Jesus in your life this Easter in a way you've never experienced it before. God bless you. He is risen. He is risen indeed. Go in peace.
Hey everyone, we wanted to bless you with this song in a very untraditional, unconventional way. We hope you're blessed by it, and we hope you take this time to worship today. Let's sing, how great is our God, the splendor of the King. The splendor of the King, clothed in majesty, let all the earth rejoice, all the earth rejoice.
He wraps himself in light, and darkness tries to hide, and trembles at his voice, trembles at his voice.
How great is our God, sing with me, how great is our God, and all will see how great is our God.
Age to age he stands, and time is in his hands, beginning and the end, beginning and the end.
God had three in one. Father, Spirit, Son, the Lion and the Lamb, the Lion and the Lamb.
How great is
Our God, sing with me, how great is our God. Oh, we'll see how great is our God. Let's sing that again. How great is our God. Sing with me, how great is our God. And all will see how great is our God. Let's shout it out, name above all names. You're the name above all names. You are worthy of all praise. And my heart will sing, how great is our God. You're the name above all names. You are worthy of all praise. And my heart will sing, how great is our God. Let's lift it up, shout it out. How great is our God. Sing with me, how great is our God. And all will see how great is our God. Let's sing that again. How great is our God. Sing with me, how great is our God. And all will see how great is our God. Amen.